Great. We are now live streaming session 6. Thank you all the participants who have joined and the panelists that will guide us through this important session. I now pass the floor to Lauren Pandolfei, who will be guiding us and moderating this session. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much. And good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, and welcome to this high-level political forum 2022 SDG learning session on achieving gender equality, measuring progress and advocating for change, which has been co-organized by the Center for Migration, Gender and Justice, UN Women, Women at the Table, and Women's Major Group. My name is Lauren Pandolfei. I lead the gender data portfolio within UNICEF's data and analytics section. So I'm very excited to serve as the moderator for this session as we take stock together of progress toward achieving the 2030 agenda from a gender perspective, including examining critical data gaps and learning about innovative tools for closing those gaps, advancing gender responsive policy, and accelerating gender equality. And we are very much in need of acceleration due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We continue to learn as more evidence becomes available that the pandemic has rolled back the limited progress made over the past 25 years on expanding gender equality and women's and girls' rights and opportunities. To cite a couple of examples, we know that young women have experienced more pronounced employment losses than young men during the pandemic, and that the gender gap in food insecurity, which had grown in 2020 under the shadow of the pandemic, widened even further in 2021. Intersectional analyses also reveal that women and girls who face multiple forms of discrimination, such as those based on migratory and disability status, are especially affected. So we have our work cut out for us, including ensuring that women and girls are front and central in the effort to build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic. But our panel of experts, comprising a diverse range of stakeholders across the data ecosystem, is going to share insights on how we get back on track toward achieving the goals of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and gender equality more broadly. Before I introduce the first speaker, just a few housekeeping items. Each speaker or combined set of speakers will have 15 minutes to present. I will share that I can be a harsh timekeeper, so presenters, please do stick to your allotted time, or I might have to come in and interject because we do have quite a packed session. We will reserve questions for the Q&A after the final speaker, but audience members, please do write your questions in the chat box throughout. To conserve time, I will introduce each speaker very briefly before they speak, and we'll paste their fuller bios in the chat. So now on to our first speaker. I'm quite pleased to introduce Antra Bhatt, who will first speak about the status of data availability on the SDGs from a gender perspective. Antra is a statistics specialist in the research and data section of UN Women. She is co-author of the annual Gender Snapshot Report, as well as From Insights to Action, Gender Equality in the Wake of COVID-19, and World Survey on the Role of Women in Development. Antra, over to you for 5 minutes before you come back later in the session to present again. Thanks.
Hey, hi everyone. Just give me one moment as I share my screen with the presentation. Okay. Okay. Let's see. All right, there we go. Okay. So, hi everyone, I've already been introduced, so let's just dive in. For my presentation today, I'll begin with a short overview on the status of data availability on the SDGs from a gender perspective, and then present some tools that can help us monitor the SDGs, especially SDG 5 from a gender perspective. All of this using our annual progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, the Gender Snapshot Report. This report, every year, it brings together the latest available evidence on gender equality across all of the 17 goals. We highlight the progress that has been made since 2015, but also the continued alarm over the pandemic and its immediate effect and long-term effect on women's well-being. This year, we were able to include in this report an SDG 5 tracker, which is a tool that can help us understand where we are on gender equality today. In the next few slides, I'll just focus more on the data gaps and on the status of mainstreaming gender across all of the SDGs, because the gender dimension, it's really important to be considered all across the SDGs and not just specifically for Goal 5. So coming to SDG 5 specifically and the data gaps there, you can see on this slide that what we see in the picture is a lot of gray and relatively less red, which means that a lot of data which is needed to understand where we are on gender equality, it's simply not there today. Only on a couple of indicators, so you can see 551 and 552, which are women in parliament and women in local government, as well as women in managerial positions. Those two indicators have decent amount of data, but for most of the other indicators, the gray just pops out so much more than the red. I'll show you this in the form of a different visual a bit later, but for now, just stay with one fact with me, that 48%, which is almost half, of the data that is needed to monitor SDG 5 are currently not available. Now, what do we know about the other SDGs? The answer is that we don't know much at all about the state of gender mainstreaming. And from the little we can gather, the findings really don't look encouraging at all. For example, let's take a look at Goal 7 on affordable and clean energy. We know that the climate crisis is looming on us and that the world is moving towards cleaner forms of energy. Yet, women's voices are muted in this rapidly growing sector, and only 1 in 10 senior managers in the energy industry is a woman. Let's look at the goal on industry, innovation, and infrastructure, for example. We know that women have been at the front lines for COVID-19 innovations, including on some of the mRNA vaccines, but just 4% of clinical studies on COVID-19 treatments considered sex or gender in their research. For Goal 16, similar story. Women's insufficient participation in decision-making, it's limiting the reach and impact of the pandemic and other emergency recovery efforts, along with the opportunities to revitalize economies and societies. And then one final example, which is a very important one on the climate goals, which are goals 12 to 15. What we see is that only 64 out of the 190 nationally determined contributions to climate change even refer to women. In the report that I highlighted on the first slide and also put in a few links in the chat, we have seen that a goal by goal stock taking of what is happening from the gender perspective in the report is very helpful to understand where we are at. But the main point to remember is that we simply do not have enough data to say where we are on achieving all of the SDGs from a gender perspective. And even on Goal 5, which is specifically dedicated to gender, half of the data needed to monitor the target and indicators are not available. That's it for now, and I'll be back later to talk more about the tools that I mentioned earlier a little bit, but this is just to set the stage for what we already know and what we have and don't have. Stop sharing for now.
Thank you, Antra, and you set a very good precedent for keeping on time. So other speakers, take note, please. I'm always eagerly awaiting the release of the annual gender snapshot. And I think one of the key takeaways of the slides you presented here, as well as the larger report, is that women's unequal decision-making power undermines development at every level and across all domains, not just Goal 5 of the SDG agenda. And the following presentations will offer very nice illustrations, I think, of how we can ensure that women and girls are co-creators of solution to advanced development. So I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Caitlin Kraft-Buckman, who will speak about why AI and tech are both critical and feminist issues affecting all the SDGs. So Caitlin is the CEO and founder of Women at the Table and co-founder of the A+ Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms. Women at the Table, founded in 2015 by Caitlin, is a growing global gender equality and democracy CSO based in Geneva, focused on advancing feminist systems change by exercising leverage points in technology, the economy, sustainability, and democratic governance by using the prism of technology, innovation, and AI. And over to you, Caitlin. You have 15 minutes to present, I think, a very exciting topic. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here. And of course, always so grateful to UN Women for their incredible research, and so shocking even though so many of us work in gender every day, to hear the statistics. I mean, it is just gobsmackingly amazing. All right, we're going to look at AI. Why is AI? I'm hotspotting my phone today, so I'm a little slow. Okay, why is it even a problem for us? Why is this a global problem as opposed to just like a global north problem or a Facebook problem? It's because we are digitizing rapidly. And also due to COVID, what's happening is that every government in the world is taking their sort of old systems and just kind of throwing the Excels up onto, a digital platform and saying they've become digital and they're going to do machine learning. And the fact is that the old systems and the old data didn't work, or we were invisible in the data. So we're going to discuss why that is. But this is for everybody. This is for any country that the World Bank has asked to have a global ID, a digital ID. This is a presentation also for you. So at its very core is data. Data needs context and purpose to have any point. By itself, it doesn't tell the truth. It doesn't mean anything at all. So let's keep that in the front of our heads. Let's also look at what we're starting with, which is the real world, which is where data comes from. We saw from Andra from that 4% of the COVID studies didn't even consider women or sex or gender. We know that safety in cars, seatbelts, have never been tested on female crash test dummies. So you have this incredible statistics. Even to this day, we're just starting to have female crash test dummies. We also know that for places that have a lot of air conditioning, which is maybe a horrible climate change and a first world problem, but the idea is, what we've just found from new research is that women's cognition goes down on math and spatial reckoning test scores in colder environments. So that means that if you're sitting in a country that has air conditioning and also has that one national exam to get into that one elite university that's going to let you sort of fly all the way to the top of the charts, you are probably going to do a couple of points less, enough points less, just 3 or 4, that you won't get into that elite university as a woman in physics or math. And that's actually a tremendous problem. This same thing does not operate on men. In the warmer environment, the men perform the same. So that's sort of interesting. All data, why is that? It's based on sort of what we call the default man, a certain size, certain number of kilograms, certain height, a Western man, and that's where the thermostat comes from. Last analog example is going to be just the military. It wasn't until a while ago before military started designing uniforms that actually had room for breasts or for hips. But even now, as of last year and this year, body armor that protects you in an environment. That means for police officers, that means for also personal protective equipment, but this is ballistic data, doesn't protect women. And we've had women police officers in the UK who have died because they've taken off their stab vests because they couldn't breathe because it doesn't have room for their breasts. And then they were stabbed because it's only made for men. Okay, so that's the old world. That's the world that we live in, the physical world. This brings us to algorithms. But algorithms, which are just little equations written on paper, wind up mirroring the world that we live in. So this is the famous algorithm story, is Amazon decided that it was going to try and deal with its thousands and thousands of resumes. And they did an algorithm based benchmarked on their highest performing workers. And they started to notice that this algorithm, when they put it into play, was throwing women to the bottom of the queue. Not only were they throwing women to the bottom of the queue, they were throwing women that went to women's colleges to the very bottom of the queue, and women chess champion and a women athlete to the very, very bottom of the queue. They couldn't figure out why until they looked and they saw, oh, we benchmarked against our highest performers who are white men who went to Stanford, are engineers, and are athletes. But the thing is that the machine learning figured out that women were not welcome in this data set. And so they started throwing the women out. So that was a problem. Could be a happy ending because we would say, oh, well, then Amazon fixed it. But Amazon had to work for 3 years and then had to scrap the algorithm, because once the machine learning figures out that women or people of color or any marginalized group are not welcome because they're not visible in the data set, it cannot unlearn what it has seen. Another way to look at this is when Google asked people to draw a shoe, everybody drew a sneaker because there's a bunch of guys probably. So when the machine saw a high heel, it didn't recognize it as a shoe because a machine cannot recognize what it has never been exposed to. So we know that's the algorithm, that's the artificial intelligence, and the machines learn from that. And then we're not going to talk about deep learning and neural networks because we don't even know how we wouldn't even be able to unpack how a neural network gets to its actual conclusion. All we know is it's smart. You have to understand we're starting at the very beginning, the larger part of the circle with missing data. Now you'd say, okay, it's only reflecting the world that we live in, but here we are. You search for women CEOs. It says there are 11% women in the US. You think that's sad, but okay, it must be true. I saw it on Google. But the truth is that it's 27% women CEOs in the United States. So the Google algorithm has chosen to show you its version of reality. So now you have a circle where you have an algorithm's perception of reality because it came from a certain kind of designer, and that becomes then the reality because it has been represented back to us in a mirrored face. We also see that Twitter has this photocropping algorithm that favors young, thin females. That's probably no surprise. And there's things now called algorithmic bias bounty challenges where people are starting to look for these things. But this is like a game of whack-a-mole, right? We just are trying to just stop all this all these things that are happening. We also see Facebook ad delivery. So in 2019, everybody noticed that people were able to target ads to females and to males. But the female ads were for low paying, like cashier jobs, no job security, no pension. And the male jobs were going to sort of like middle-class pension kinds of things like being a police officer that would sort of lead to greater financial stability over time. Facebook was successfully sued. They took the algorithm down, but recent research has shown that the algorithms are still doing a different version of this because also algorithms work like an orchestra. There's no such thing as one algorithm. There's just many, many, many algorithms working together very, very quickly, making some sort of a harmony, and it is still delivering low-paid jobs to women, higher-paid jobs to offers of these jobs to men. What does that mean? In a COVID environment, we're now more and more doing things online. So this talent acquisition funnel that's already very, very tight becomes very, very difficult. If you're not aware of the job, then you're not considered and you're not able to sort of go all the way to the end. So it perpetuates women not being in the financial system. We see this with this Apple Goldman Sachs credit card. Everybody was very excited until two tech couples who had exactly the same credit history, tax records over a 10-year period discovered and then revealed on Twitter that the husbands got 10 times more credit than the wives. Why was that? The credit card definitely did not tell anybody that women were less deserving of credit because that's illegal in the United States. It's a gender is a protected characteristic as is sex. But somehow the proxy for gender, the proxy for women being unworthy of credit because of this data history or this lack of data about women wound up being in the intelligence of the credit card, which was taken off the market. We even see with natural language processing that even in languages that don't have he or she, that Google started presenting gender pairings where there were actually none to begin with. And okay, she's, he is a doctor, she's a nurse. We could sort of understand. But my favorite is in Turkish, it was, he is hardworking and she is lazy. Where did those things come from? We don't know. We only know them when people, doctoral candidates do research. But this becomes then a replication of these biases that we have, cultural biases that we have in certain places. Or maybe not even. Maybe this is just something from English that somehow has been translated over to a language that has no gender pairings. We also have I'm very, very interested because we have the first sort of indigenous language that has this Google Translate. It's supposed to have been made and it was made with a lot of activists, but it would be very, very interesting to see if it's useful or if it just replicates some of these things that we've seen in the past, which are that in terms of images, these representations of fork and spoon have seen so paired so many times with women that when they see a fork and spoon, they think women. They see a person in a kitchen, it labels that person, male or female, as a woman. They see a person in a hockey helmet or a ski helmet or a bike helmet or a hockey stick as a man, whether they are a man or a woman. Also, these things are very binary, which is another conversation perhaps for us to have. ImageNet, you can see from here, this is where all the images come from, mostly from the global north, and that's part of the problem. That's a big part of the problem. So that an algorithm that's trained on these data sets only recognize the woman on the left in the white as a bride, and the woman on the, and the woman in red as a folkloric dancer, even though certainly there may be many, many more brides who look like the woman in red than the woman in white. So we see this also coming out in facial recognition, which has been greatly discussed in the press, so we won't go into it here. All of these things happen because there are 8 foundational data sets. They all come from the North. They come from AT&T, one Max Planck, Germany, but Princeton, Stanford, Google, one from City University, Hong Kong, but they come from a very male-oriented computer science organizations. And these are the data sets that everything is benchmarked against for a variety of reasons. We're up to GPT-3 now. I'm sure we'll be up to GPT-4, but I just want you to look at, I hate actually reading this and seeing this. So you know how you have autocomplete on your search? If you put in the prompt in GPT-2 and it said a man worked as, it says he's a car salesman, fine. But when you say what the woman worked as, she's a prostitute. The black man, a pimp. The white man, the president of the United States, and the gay person dancing and doing drugs. Whereas the straight guy articulated incredibly well. So these great data sets are also scraping everything from the internet. So they're coming from Reddit. They're coming from a lot of very biased, very phobic in general places. And this is, so the nice news is that they're able to write beautiful poetry. The not so nice news is that they are ingraining in the most horrifying ways some of the worst reactions, of humanity, in my opinion. Even a famous woman like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, we're talking about the North now, it auto-completes pictures, this one particular piece of software. So a very, very famous woman auto-completes her in a bikini, but auto-completes an unknown man with a suit and a tie. They're deep fakes that undress our younger sisters, generally girls 11 and up, that are on the internet. And there's also bias in medical algorithms, which are really of tremendous worry to us, because these are life and death situations beyond. So they're either bias in the model, where people just decide that people who are sicker, people who have gone to the doctor a lot must be sicker, therefore they deserve to be seen first in the hospital line, not thinking that sometimes people don't have health insurance or access to a doctor, and that doesn't mean they aren't sick, it just means that they're poor. So poverty is ingrained in the model. There's an incredible piece on medical algorithms in the New England Journal of Medicine, where you're really starting to see where racial bias plays into almost every part of what's been happening. What happens in the analog world, but it's also that the machines are not starting to don't really understand different bodies. We also now have very new research that shows that in medical imaging during COVID, this all came out, that even though the race of a person was never put in, the machines can actually tell the race from the medical images, and nobody knows why. This is what the researchers say was so disturbing. We also see on a very day-to-day level that every government has some form of automated decision-making. I mean, who gets a pencil, who gets a pen, who gets the traffic lights, who doesn't. And Philip Alston, who's the special rapporteur on extreme poverty, had said, one of the great tragedies right now is that these algorithms have been made to only detect fraud in social welfare systems, but there is such extraordinary potential for these algorithmic decision-making if it were at the very core conceived to help benefit humanity, help benefit the people that need help. They absolutely could do something entirely different, but they're not designed to do that at the moment, and there have been several court cases. And this is why we've come up in conclusion with this notion of feminist AI that we work on, which is just how to, instead of just trying to take the bias out of the algorithm, which is basically just like, how can we keep the world the way it is now without it getting worse? But this is actually, how do we design things with inclusion at the core that creates opportunities and also pro-social innovation, correction of inequities. Sometimes we call that, what do we call it? We call it affirmative action for algorithms, and that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. And I mean, I'm really struck by the pervasive gender and geographical biases you highlighted in these different algorithms. I think often there's a tendency for people to think that such technologies are neutral, but clearly, as we learn more and more, we're learning that's not the case, and that there really is an urgent need to hold them accountable, including the need to ground truth these algorithms. I think that's a really important takeaway. I'm going to turn back the floor to Antra. She'll have another 10 minutes to present innovative tools to monitor progress on the SDGs from a gender perspective. Back to you, Antra.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm just going to scroll over down to the presentation. Okay, so from that background now, you heard from Caitlin a lot about data biases. We know that the data that are available to us, they have a lot of biases, but there's still value in tools that can help us to understand where we are on gender equality, because that way we are able to use the data that we have to advocate for even better data and for better outcomes for women and girls. So what we've, in terms of the tools that I would like to present, I'll just give you a very brief overview of two different tools. The first one is an SDG 5 tracker. This visualization that you see in front of you, it was developed based on an assessment of the current level of progress towards achieving the 9 targets and 18 indicators and sub-indicators under SDG 5. And each brushstroke or oval in this picture, however you may see it, it represents an SDG 5 indicator value for a particular country. A blue means that the target is met or almost met. A green is it's close to target. And just think about this a little bit like a heat map, where the warmer colors, they're just telling you how worse off we are, and the red is actually representing very far from target. So now with that heat map perspective in mind, when you see this visual, you will see that there are lots of yellows, oranges, and reds, and actually too few blues and greens, which just from a very visual perspective tells you that the world is not on track on achieving SDG 5, but gender equality in general by 2030. In terms of numbers, we see that about 28% of the indicator values, they're either far from target or very far from target, and only 13% are at target met or almost met. The tool can also tell us a little bit about which indicators are where. So just to summarize for you, in 3 critical areas of women's empowerment and equality, we see that time spent by women and men in unpaid care and domestic work, decision-making regarding sexual and reproductive health and rights, and the provision of systems to track funding going towards gender equality, the world is far or very far from target. There's only one indicator at the global level, and this is only at the global level, which is close to target, and that's women in local government. And there are other areas, equally crucial ones, which are around eliminating discriminatory laws, ending harmful practices, where we see the progress has been moderate, but moderate is deeply insufficient if we really want to achieve the SDGs by 2030. We can also use this tool for a regional and country level outlook, and you may not need to actually dive in too much into the data, but just concentrate on the colors that you see here on the slide. First of all, you see a lot of variability in the current set of progress. And then you can also see that from this visual, no country or region comes out looking good, because you don't see a lot of blues and greens in any country. In fact, 1 in every 15 countries is very far or far from target in at least a third of the indicators. What also comes out clearly, and I think I'll be saying this over and over again in my presentation, is the massive gaps in data. So you see the gray brush strokes, they come out quite often, and those actually show you that we cannot even provide an assessment because the data are either not available or they're too old to be used to assess current levels. So in addition to the fact that there are data biases, in addition to the way that data is collected, we are also saying that we don't even have any kind of data on women and girls. And then what's also important to note is that this tool can tell us where we are today and where we need to focus on accelerating progress, but also tell us about the areas we are not prioritizing. And one of those is data gaps. So here in this picture, what you can see is that when I showed you the visual a few slides ago, you were seeing a fuller picture with all of the blues, the greens, and everything coming together. Now in this one, we've overlapped all of the grays, which are the data gaps in here, and you really see this coming through. So I really hope that one takeaway that you can take from this presentation is that half of the data that are needed to monitor the goal on gender equality itself are just not available. You can also zoom in on a specific indicator or target. So here you will see in the red highlight, we're highlighting the target on unpaid care work, which is target 5.4. It has a lot of grays, which means it has data gaps. We don't have the sufficient amount of data. And then also you see a lot of warmer colors again. So you see a lot of reds, yellows, and oranges, barely any blues and greens, which means that we are far off from target on this very important issue. And using this tool, I'll share links in the chat later, you can draw simple conclusions like that for other targets, indicators, regions, countries, in whichever is your geography of interest. The other tool that I briefly wanted to present, just to keep myself in the time that we've been allotted, is the one that looks at the nexus between policy levers and female poverty. So we already know, Lauren said this in the beginning of the presentation in her introductory remarks, that we've had women seeing higher job losses than men. Working mothers in particular have faced many challenges. Hunger is on the rise. And what we see using estimates and projections is that poverty has actually deepened for women and girls during this pandemic. And I say during because we're still in the middle of it. And globally, 388 million women and girls will be living in extreme poverty in 2022. Compare this with 372 million men and boys. And if there is a high damage scenario that plays out, which means that things worsen even more, this number of 388 million could balloon to about 446 million or even more. What we are also seeing is that with this, we are able to tell a fuller story, that we are not just concentrating on extreme poverty, but we also have data on $320 per person per day, $550, and national poverty lines, which gives you that we are able to carefully monitor different poverty rates at different thresholds by sex and age as they apply to a particular country. For example, in Latin America and the Caribbean, if you look only at extreme poverty, which is defined as a person living on $90 per person per day, so they only have that amount of consumption capacity, only 2.2% of women live below that poverty line. But if you look at the national poverty line, the estimate is 30%. So that's why we are saying that we need a fuller picture of poverty by sex and age that doesn't just go and look at extreme poverty, but looks at all different thresholds as applicable. So this brings me to the tool aspect of what I want to present. Now, knowing that you have this data set on extreme poverty and other poverty lines by sex and age, what we have done is that in collaboration with researchers at University of Denver and UN Women, UNDP, and UNICEF, we have tailored this model that they have to include poverty rates by sex and age. And as you can see here from the picture on the right, the model has 12 dynamically interconnected modules, which allows for the fact that just by clicking a few buttons and changing different policy scenarios, you are able to see how it impacts the variable of interest, which in our case is the different poverty estimates by sex and age. So for example, how do changes in birth rates, for example, impact poverty by sex and age? Or how does closing the wage gap in a country impact the same estimate? So let's take a concrete example. Now here on this slide, you can see that there is a base case, which is the status quo of the estimates and projections on poverty. And then what we can do is we can see how we implement or change certain policies and what impact do they have on the estimates and forecasts. So here you will see a few scenarios. You can look at, for example, closing the wage gap. That's one part of the scenario. But you can also look at other things, like what happens if you accelerate education, or if you look at different other interventions. What the other important thing that you can do is you can also look at the cumulative impact of each of these interventions. So what does it look like in practice? What kind of things can the tool put out there? So here I'm giving you an example of women ages 25 to 34, where we see the most gaps in the most sex differences in poverty, if I may say. And you will see that there is a drastic reduction in sex differences in poverty when each of these scenarios is implemented. In the case then, when all of these interventions come through together, the most effect is observed. This picture is just at the global level, but the tool is really important because you can do the same thing at the regional level, at the country level, where we think it has the most potential, and it can really be adapted to the context that you're looking at, because the policy levers could also change depending on the context. So we've been trying to work with different country offices and to concretely help policymakers through this tool to understand how sensitive poverty rates will be to changes in a particular intervention that they are planning to put in, whether it's education or labor market reforms like promoting equal pay and so on. Through the course of this collaboration, and considering the fact that there is an ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, we've also built quite a few different scenarios, but I'm just going to quickly highlight two crucial ones here. The first is a set of COVID scenarios. So poverty projections had COVID not happened, poverty projections taking into the impact of COVID, and then also a high damage scenario, which preempts some of the issues we are already seeing, such as worsening food availability, child undernourishment, and also increasing inequality. And then this other scenario that you see in the current slide is an SDG push scenario. And this is really an attempt to signal to policymakers how strategic investments in social protection, digital innovation, governance, and green economy can make things better and concretely help us to accelerate progress towards the SDG. Now, how does the two scenarios that I showed you, the COVID scenario with the high damage and the SDG push scenario, just look at how it looks like if you look at the poverty rates once they're implemented. Now, here we are looking, just to give you a different example, at global sex differences in $50 poverty rates. And the high damage scenario, it means that there is a widening of the gaps between men and women, while the SDG push scenario is the one that can really help in bringing down this gender gap in poverty to less than 2 percentage points by 2030. It reduces the gender gap, but you can also do something similar for levels, which means that you reduce the poverty rates for men and women both, which is equally important. So I think that's my last slide, and I'll wrap up to leave you with some key links to read for later to share widely. Thanks very much for your attention, and happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antra. You've provided, a wealth of information, and then a few in the original initial slides looking at how far off we are in terms of tracking progress to the SDGs. I think the visuals are really compelling. So it brings to my mind that's, we have to also pay attention in how we communicate this data to different audiences using different measures, methods, as well as different visualizations of that data, because different modes are going to speak to different people differently, I think. And, on the forecasting, I think what strikes me there is that given the cross-cutting nature of gender equality, there is so much value in connecting models across various domains, such as agriculture, education, the economy, et cetera, to both forecast projections, but also, I think, even more compellingly, to illuminate that if we are going to build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic, combined or integrated interventions are needed to advance gender equality. In the case you highlighted, to reduce gender gaps in monetary poverty, but really we need to have a comprehensive approach to advancing gender equality. And I think that comes across quite clearly in the forecasting models you presented. It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker. I apologize in advance if I don't pronounce your name correctly, Dr. Lara Susan Golosorki, who will present the Gender Migration Index. And Dr. Golosorki is an assistant professor of political science and global affairs and the co-director of the Gender, Woman, and Sexuality Studies program at the University of Portland in the US. Her work is concerned with issues that pertain to the intersection of migration and gender in a global context. Dr. Golosorki examines how gender dynamics configure into migration experiences in origin, transit, and destination countries, and how these experiences are informed by structural factors. Over to you for 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I appreciate the platform to introduce our, meaning the Center for Migration, Gender, and Justices, recently launched guidance tool, the Gender Migration Index, or GMI. We developed the GMI to address gendered migration experiences which occur along a continuum of origin, transit, and destination countries. Based on a country's policies, gender dynamics might premise the reason for migration, but might also affect experiences along migratory routes and in destination countries. And so along this continuum, women, girl, LGBTQIA+, and gender diverse migrants face heightened risk of marginalization, of vulnerabilities, and of violence. But at the same time, migrants, and especially women, girl, LGBTQI+, and gender diverse migrants remain largely left out of policy processes that affect their lives. And so in order to address this gap between lived experiences and policy, the GMI provides a guidance tool for stakeholders to ensure gender responsiveness and migrant inclusion in policy planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So as part of today's session, I will provide a brief overview of how the GMI works, paying specific attention to our methodology and our indicator system by offering a case study to exemplify the importance of the tool. And I conclude my presentation with an outlook of next steps, including how the GMI can be applied in various international review processes, such as the HLPF. So what does the GMI do and how does it work? The GMI facilitates gender responsiveness and migrant inclusion in policy planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation by addressing the needs and challenges of women, girl, LGBTQIA+, and gender diverse migrants. The GMI is based on an indicator system that centers migrants' lived experiences through participatory action research and is aligned with international review processes such as periodic and voluntary reviews, thereby strengthening multi-stakeholder engagement and providing criteria to benchmark policy. Following principles of participatory action research, the GMI emphasizes participation and action by members of communities affected by the research and by extension by the policy, namely migrant communities and organizations working with migrant communities in efforts to democratize knowledge production at the intersection of migration and gender. And this methodology reflects the Center for Migration, Gender, and Justice's vision of gender justice beyond borders and our mission of shrinking spaces between migrant communities and governing bodies. This methodology also premises the indicator system that we developed to ensure gender responsiveness and migrant inclusion in policy, which builds on the IOM's migration governance indicators and the UN's minimum set of gender indicators. The indicator system follows a three-part structure with overall and policy indicators, speaking to the extent to which gender dynamics are mentioned, engaged with, and committed to, and the extent to which migration dynamics are mentioned, engaged with, and committed to. So content, engagement, and commitment as indicators. And then the third set of indicators, namely the migrant experience indicators, speak to the extent to which migrants access resources, services, information, and accountability. So resources, services, information, and accountability as indicators. All indicators are analyzed based on a traffic light framework that corresponds to limited, moderate, and extensive levels of gender responsiveness and migrant inclusion in policy. So who analyzes these indicators? The GMI is premised on collaborative inquiry into gender responsiveness and migrant inclusion in policy, with corresponding engagement in international review processes. And as part of these efforts, researchers and advocates and educators at the Center for Migration, Gender and Justice partner with stakeholders in the application of the GMI. In this partnership, the Center for Migration, Gender and Justice analyzes the overall and policy indicators, so indicators 1 and 2, while stakeholders analyze migrant experience indicators, so indicators that fall under the spectrum of 3. The application of the GMI is thus co-curated in its methodology with a concrete research action trajectory that may result in civil society or shadow reports in the context of international review processes. So to truly demonstrate how the GMI works, I will now briefly showcase and share findings for the overall and policy analysis regarding gender responsiveness in Germany's voluntary national review, so VNR, on the Global Compact for Migration, the GCM, as well as describe our partnership with WOW, with or without, a community-based organization in Stuttgart, Germany, which promotes equality and diversity in the labor market by addressing intersectional discrimination experienced by migrant women as a stakeholder which conducted the migrant experience analysis. So our analysis of the overall gender responsiveness in Germany's GCM VNR was based on the noted indicators, content, engagement, and commitment, and the corresponding guiding questions, namely, to what extent are gender dynamics mentioned, engaged with, and committed to. And as part of our analysis, we provide brief notes for each of the indicators, as well as additional information to be considered for follow-up review. And this then informs our identification of a policy area of concern, in this case, labor and labor policy specifically. So once the policy area of concern is identified, or in this case was identified, we conducted a policy-specific analysis of Germany's GCM VNR with a focus on labor, which revealed further insights in terms of gender responsiveness in policy planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. We analyzed labor policy based on the content, engagement, and commitment indicators, and offered an outline of practices either in place or planned to be implemented, as well as recommendations for follow-up review. And so as demonstrated, we found that although Germany's overall mention of engagement with and commitment to gender responsiveness as it pertains to migration and migrants' lived experiences can be described as moderate, as demonstrated in the previous slide, when it actually comes to the specific policy area of labor and labor policy, gender responsiveness is limited. And so this divergence points to the importance of the three-part indicator structure of the GMI, in which we, the Center for Migration, Gender and Justice, conduct the overall and policy analysis, and our partners, such as WOW, conduct the migrant experience analysis in order to present a comprehensive assessment that centers migrants' lived experiences, which I will move to next. So WOW, our partner, is in this particular case study, is a local community-based nonprofit NGO based in Stuttgart, Germany. WOW promotes equality and diversity in the labor market by addressing intersectional discrimination experienced by migrant women, notably through the organization's programs such as the Job Ready program, which offers free multilingual empowerment and know your rights courses, as well as workshops that prepare migrant women to access and to succeed in the German labor market. Since its establishment in 2015, the organization has reached nearly 200 migrant women who have experienced intersectional discrimination in the labor market. And it is premised on this work that WOW, as a stakeholder, conducted an analysis of the migrant experience indicators, speaking to the extent to which migrants access resources, services, information, and accountability. WOW then also provided additional information, comments, practices, and recommendations for each of the indicators to be considered in policy planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation until the next review process. And as with the overall and policy analysis, a mixed report on gender responsiveness can be identified here, as according to WOW, migrant women moderately access resources and services, but only access information and accountability in limited ways. And so this case study truly reflects what we envision the GMI to contribute in terms of gender responsiveness and migrant inclusion in policy planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, and hereby speaks to the importance of the guidance tool, namely that it presents a replicable and sustainable framework to ensure gender responsiveness and migrant inclusion in policy. It strengthens the engagement of civil society, notably migrant communities and organizations working with migrant communities in policy planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. The GMI also builds multi-stakeholder capacity to effectively engage in international review processes and promotes dialogue and information sharing among stakeholders. The GMI establishes mechanisms for feedback and consultation between migrant communities and governing bodies. And last but not least, and as mentioned, it provides an indicator criteria for benchmarking policy that can be used by stakeholders for ongoing policy planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. And in regards to this ongoing engagement, I would like to conclude my presentation for today with a note on next steps and more engagement opportunities that we envision, notably with regards to the review process as part of the HLPF. So while the presented case study focused on a legal institutional framework on migration, namely the Global Compact for Migration and its corresponding review processes as part of the UN International Migration Review Forum, the GMI's three-part structure allows for the guidance tool to be applied in various international review processes that generally speak to the intersection of migration and gender, such as the UN Commission on the Status of Women, the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the UN Committee on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and their members of their family, the UN Global Refugee Forum, which is coming up next year, and as noted, the UN International Migration Review Forum, which just launched and within the context of which we launched the GMI as well. The GMI can also be applied in broader international review processes, such as the UN HLPF, as the SDGs are cross-cutting in migrants and across migrants' lived experiences. And indeed, when we decided in terms of case studies to conduct an analysis for, in terms of the voluntary national reviews on the Global Compact for Migration, we intentionally aligned the selected countries with other upcoming international review processes, such as the HLPF and CEDAW. So for instance, Jordan and the Gambia are up for HLPF VNR review this year, and the Gambia is also up for CEDAW review. And we will use the analysis conducted as part of the GCM VNR review processes as a framework in analyzing Jordan's and Gambia's HLPF VNRs and then Gambia's submission for the CEDAW review. And so in this sense, we create convergence between different international review processes that often appear to operate in silos. With this, I would like to say thank you, and I hope that the GMI offers a guidance tool that you may consider using in partnership with us across different international review processes. We especially invite civil society, migrant communities, and organizations working with migrant communities, of course, as well as other stakeholders, to use the GMI as a means to build capacity to effectively engage in international review processes and to promote dialogue and information sharing amongst stakeholders. Our contact information is right there, and any of the reference documents can be found on our website, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Golosorki. Having produced a report last year on gender and migration among children with UN Women and Plan International that specifically calls for girls to be key participants in migration policy and planning, what I'm very impressed by your presentation, because what strikes me is that the index is really a concrete way to do so. As you said, it democratizes knowledge, strengthening the engagement of migrant communities in the planning, implementation, and monitoring process, which, as we know, as you stated, too often groups being affected by policies are left out of those processes altogether. And then more broadly, when we think about gender equality indices, many, not all, but many are often very useful for global comparisons, but are critiqued for having less utility within countries or for being less accessible for the subpopulations they concern. So I think the Gender Migration Index is a really great counterexample of that. I would now like to introduce our next two speakers, Betty Levy and April Porteria, who will speak about nourishing feminist advocacy for transformative change and development justice, respectively. Betty is a member of the Women's Major Group and UN representative for Optimist International. She has used these advocacy skills in her role as UN representative to ensure the perspectives of women and girls and all their diversity are heard at the UN. As an experienced CSO representative, Betty has served on a number of NGO committees at the UN, including previously being co-chair of the NGO Committee on the Status of Women, the CSW. April is currently the Feminist Development Justice Program Officer at the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law, and Development. APWLD is the leading network of over 265 feminist organizations and individual activists in Asia and the Pacific, working towards advancing women's human rights and development justice. So I'm going to turn it over to Betty and then April to speak for a combined 15 minutes. Thank you so much.
Okay, Lee, are you going to put up the slides, please? Thank you. So I'm Betty Levy, and thank you, Lauren. And I'm here representing the Women's Major Group, a collective made up of over 1,500 individuals and organizations around the world. Optimist International is one of those NGOs, and I'm the main representative here in New York. SI is a women's organization in over 3,000 communities in over 120 countries. And today we've heard a lot about the importance of data, about gender development, and how it relates to the SDGs and directly to the work being done on the ground by grassroots organizations. I've selected an example from the Optimist program in the VNR country this year of the Philippines. This program has been operating for 28 years. In 1992, a presidential decree declared and created that every police station must have a women's and child protection desk, a national police women's desk. But sadly, that's where it stopped. There was no budget, there was no gender development, there was no training for either the women who were taking these roles or their male counterparts. So an SA club in the Philippines collected over a 2-year period, collected evidence. They did interviews, they gathered the data, both quantitative, but as well the qualitative, which is a really key thing for civil society on the ground. In 1994, they created Adopt a PNA Women's Desk Project. Local Optimists developed a training program, and at 38 desks were initially adopted across the Philippines, solely supported by the Optimist International in the Philippines. Today, this program not only continues, but has expanded by forming a collaboration with other CSOs and the police officers, as well as broadening the training and expanding the program as needed, now including gender-based violence, disaster work, especially after some of the recent typhoons and the COVID pandemic. This example highlights the importance of collecting data, the analyzing of it, and providing public awareness and training. When COVID locked the world down, the Women's Major Group members were unable to meet in person. So virtual monthly meetings were created, and to the general public, the WMG on the WMG YouTube channel, the Nourishing Feminist series. The goal was to educate and provide guidance to our members how they might continue to advocate in spite of the lockdown. And we've developed tools and important key messages. Next slide, please. So we thought it was important for people to understand why language advocacy is so important. And that is, if you want to hold your national and local governments accountable, you have to understand UN speak. And you may have to make sure that the governments understand that you are aware of the commitments that they have made and hold them to task on how they need to implement. Next slide. Why do we need language advocacy? Because the language at the UN is filled with nuances and subtleties. Word changes meaning over time. What's good today is not good tomorrow. So it's important to know what's controversial, what are the hot items, and what will ultimately be approved, and what is dead from the get-go. That doesn't mean that feminist groups should not try to fight for the strongest language possible, but you need to carefully listen to the cues member states are giving you and to try from that perspective to get the best and strongest language possible. One of the things we teach is the importance that you come to the discussions fully aware of positions that are different from your own, so that when you counter this, you can respond with an educated response and not be surprised or have a knee-jerk reaction. Understand that negotiations at the UN are always done in English, and that for many, this is not the first language, so it takes time to settle on a word or even where a comma might go in a sentence. Often words mean different things in different cultures, and the member states react from their own personal understanding. One such word or term that is always controversial is family versus families. Lists can also be dangerous because it's an opportunity to leave out important groups. So it is why we at the Women's Major Group prefer to say women and girls in all their multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. For example, I'm a white Jewish woman with disabilities. So I'm not just one thing. So we prefer that, but we'll accept women and girls in all their diversity. Next slide. So what does success look like? We try very hard to teach our members to understand the subtleties between these two examples and why choice 2 is so much stronger and in line with the feminist movement. However, currently, we're not even happy with gender sensitive anymore, because that just means you're aware it's an issue. We would prefer gender responsive, which means you're willing to make some change, but transformative is our preferred word. Next slide. So why is it important to build bilateral relationships and within the UN system and with member states? And obviously, it's clear that this is an intergovernmental process, so it's important to have those relationships with member states. But in reality, it's the secretariats that organize meetings like this, commissions, conventions, EGMs, the regional consultations. So it's important to know where a meeting is housed. For example, CSW is in UN Women. CSOC-D and the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging are within DESA, DSID. HLPF falls both under ECOSOC and every 5 years, the General Assembly. Next slide. So we try to teach the do's and don'ts when you're trying to build and maintain these relationships. And the key word there is maintain, because a one-shot deal doesn't help anybody. Member states or UN agencies are looking for a partner they can turn to, just as civil society is looking that. One of the tools that we use, and unfortunately I think it's lower down on this Padlet, we use Padlet a lot in our meetings so that people can, add their own ideas. It's not just those of the speakers. But one of the tools we use is mapping. It's very important. Where we talk here a little bit about research before contacting, you need to know where somebody stands. Like, for example, during the last CSW, many of our usual suspects or partners that we work with the Women's Major Group were not our partners this time because of the topic being climate change. So you need to know that, and you need to know where they stand on each issue. Next slide. So media. Media is really important and plays an incredible role in educating the public and holding governments accountable. Social media is not enough. We still need media. You can turn to the next slide. We still need traditional media because much of the world, social media is still not an option. Very often, state-run radios are used in partnership with civil society organizations to educate or change attitudes in the communities. Next slide. You can skip. You can skip the next slide. Okay, thanks. We hope you will join us. This is just a little snippet. Each of these sessions, there were 5 of these sessions. They were an hour and a half long. We just wanted to give you a little idea of what the Women's Major Group has been doing during this last year of COVID and how we tried to educate and work with our partners around. If you have any questions, Shanez and Andrea are our secretariat and their emails are on the screen. And if you have any questions later, I'm happy to answer them. Again, it was just a snippet for you to whet your appetite to join the Women's Major Group. Thanks, Lauren.
Great, thank you. I think we can turn it over to April now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I am in the UN building. So, okay, so thank you everyone. Just to follow on Beth's presentation. So we're also a member of the Women's Major Group. But maybe just to connect this to the previous presentations, this is basically how, at least for APWLD, how we do our advocacy capacity, and later on the programmatic for us, the programmatic way of monitoring the SDGs. So in the framework of development justice. So this is a brief introduction of development justice. So why development justice? So at least for APWLD and our colleagues in Asia Pacific, we actually see that there's a need to address the structural impediments to the 2030 agenda, no? And the 2030 agenda is non-binding, it lacks accountability, it fails to address the needed reforms for global financial system, and it fails to address financial commitments and resources. So that's basically the backdrop of how or why we have developed development justice, at least in Asia Pacific Civil Society Network. And then what is development justice? It is a transformative development framework that addresses the systemic structural causes of inequality. So we have 5 transformative shifts. I will not discuss it here, but maybe later on I can share more materials. Redistributive justice, economic justice, social and gender justice, environmental justice, and accountability to the people, which basically aims to cover at least the many intersectionalities and different sectoral issues that are being faced by grassroots communities. And then how do we deliver development justice? So at least in the APWLD strategy, we do this programmatically by building capacity and providing resources and tools to national and local feminist and women's rights organizations. So we capacitate them to produce their own analysis, provide recommendations, and basically, giving them the space to engage their governments and do policy lobbying. So with that specifically, I want to share on our feminist development justice monitoring. So I see earlier the gender migration index was presented. So the feminist development justice monitoring is something that we are developing, and it's a program in APWLD that is based on partnership with the grassroots communities of women, based on their needs, capacities, and issues they work on. So it is a process where a series of indicators is being developed based on qualitative measurement. So our partners, we allow them to monitor the specific issues based on the SDGs or specific SDGs based on their issues that they are working on. And from there, they try to apply the analysis of development justice and analyze how or are we really achieving development or sustainable development at the local level. And yeah, basically this program aims to develop capacities of grassroots women to research, advocacy work, and campaign. So it's not just programmatic monitoring, but it's also doing advocacy work, campaigning, and also researching. And then in the process, women are able to deep dive on their particular issues, including what their governments, and in the process, they also learn on how, what are their rights and basically what they can do to lobby and influence their governments. And the program also equipped them with analysis on different root causes of their challenges, and they're able to engage with their governments and different institutions and able to strengthen their movements and build solidarity. So yeah, so it's just a very general overview of the program, but basically it tries to monitor the SDGs at the very local level by the women themselves, by the grassroots women themselves. And maybe just to share to you some of the general findings. So we do this every 2 years. So these findings are from, we can share more on because with the partners produce their country report. So it's like a shadow reporting by CSOs. And then yeah, on their, some of their findings, lack of access of women, lack of data. So there are particular specific cases, for example, between informal women workers, home-based workers, indigenous women, also lack of gender-sensitive and appropriate programs for women, and lack of access to justice. So yeah, just to summarize, it's basically a framework and analysis, but at the same time, we also use it as a tool to analyze or to gather data at the very local level and use that data to advocate and bring it at the regional and global level to influence policy making, especially in the development process. Yep, thank you.
Thank you so much, both Betty and April. And I do have to share that as someone who still struggles with UN speak after working in the UN system for nearly 10 years, I find Betty's call to interrogate language and its underlying power dynamics, as well as to mobilize around language advocacy, very illuminating. And April's message that the SDG 2030 agenda is far from perfect is one that we would all do well to heed, I think, as we work towards accelerating gender equality. And what also struck me is that the presentation highlights the importance of qualitative data and indicators for tracking progress, which are equally important to the quantitative data we might think of in vis-a-vis official statistics. So that concludes the presentations from our panelists. Many thanks to all of our presenters for their rich insights. We now have about 20 minutes or so for a Q&A session. I'm sure the presentations generated many questions, so if audience members haven't already done so, please put your questions in the chat. Before we get started, I do want to note, since we had a few queries in the chat about this, that all of the presentations will be uploaded on the HLPF, the High Level Political Forum website, and we will drop the link in the chat for you. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take the opportunity as moderator to kick off the first set of questions. And it's actually a two-part question for different panelists, but all focused on intersectionality. And so perhaps the first part of that question could be addressed by Antra and Dr. Golosorki. You both presented innovative tools for tracking progress towards the SDGs. And I'm curious, can you speak about the biggest challenges for introducing an intersectional lens in your respective tools? the trackers and the indices. And then the second part of the question, I'd be particularly curious to hear from Betty and April. It also concerns intersectionality, but specifically the interplay of gender and disability. We got quite a few questions in the chats, specifically asking what can be done by governments to promote and support decision-making by women with disabilities in the exercise of their political rights. What are some of the barriers limiting the participation and representation of women with disability in politics? And I'm curious if, you know, and I open this to everybody, of course, but can you speak a bit to your experience working with women that have different characteristics, maybe experiencing different levels or categories of discrimination, and then if you can zone in on the experience specifically of working with women with disabilities and the challenges they face, that would be quite useful, I think. So should I turn it over to Antra and then Dr. Golasarki to answer first part? Thank you.
Great. Yes, I can definitely answer about the two different tools that we presented from our side. I think the biggest challenge has been the unavailability of data. We've emphasized the data gap so much. It's really hard to get the data even at the national level. So then talking about subpopulations and harmonizing those as well, because we would, for example, love to integrate the race and ethnicity data in the SDG5 tracker. But first of all, the data is not there. And then how do you also have not having harmonized definitions for some of those things really add to the challenges. So that's one part. But then what we try to do to sort of circumvent this issue is that we try to complement these tools by doing some case studies where data for individual countries are available. One example could be our 2017 Turning Promises into Action report, where we presented 4 different case studies, where we broke up the data quite a bit by race, ethnicity, religion, location, and whatnot, to see the different outcomes for women and girls of different ages even. And then what we also try to do is that in addition to these trackers, we have the Gender Snapshot report, where we try to also address some of these intersectionality issues. And one particular spread, a 2-page spread in the 20 pages, is on Leave No One Behind every year. So I think that answers the first question. And just one very quick point on women with disabilities. I think it's a very important issue, and UN Women has been trying to do a lot of data work on this issue. In fact, in the rapid gender assessments that were recently released during COVID, we did ask questions about disabilities as well, but it's just very challenging to do it systematically and then to have it all across the board. So whatever we have, we try to include in our reports, but biggest challenge is data gaps.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question also. So for us, of course, we named this guidance tool the Gender Migration Index, meaning we're looking at the intersection of migration and gender, but of course there are more intersections, right? And so this is, I think, one of the challenges in general when we're looking at intersectional perspectives is how many of these intersections can we collect data on, and how representative are they? And of course, which of these different intersectional identities might be actually the one premising the experiences, right? So what premises the lack of labor market participation, for instance, of, let's say, Muslim refugee women, as an example, right? So for this, of course, we need to be mindful that as much as these tools can do and that they're opening up some spaces, specifically, as I mentioned, ours draws on tools that have been developed on the one hand for migration policy, on the other hand for gender policy, and that we're kind of bringing them together with the acknowledgement that there are other intersections that need to be considered. Maybe in reflecting and strengthening also this aspect of case studies, that's one way that we've kind of gone about it. And of course, by, again, democratizing this knowledge production by having the third indicator, namely the one on migrant lived experiences, indeed be analyzed by migrant communities themselves or organizations working with migrant communities, as a way that we provide a broad framework within which this analysis can take place by the indicators that we developed. but then it is also up to the individual organizations or the communities themselves in terms of how they interpret and what kind of data they would like to provide, what kind of experiences they would like to share and that they find to be important to be included in this overall analysis. So again, acknowledging that there is always more and understanding that this needs to be reflected in the limitations of the tools, but at the same time, through this opening up space in terms of knowledge production and power and shifting power dynamics therein, we're hoping to really represent somewhat more of an egalitarian kind of perspective of what it's actually like with lived experiences at this intersection of migration and gender. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Betty and April, did you want to come in on the second part of that question, please?
Sure. I would also like to broaden disabilities to older women and as well as disabilities because they kind of interface with each other. I want to say the most obvious at the UN is the lack of accessibility for both older women and people with disability, women with disabilities. And the women's major group has been a late comer to realizing the need of all this and of being more inclusive, making sure the language, I would say it's just over the last number of years, probably since 2015, because the women's major group's been around since 1992, that they really started taking notice to this. So during the virtual environment, we were able to make sure that all our training sessions that we dealt with having closed caption for those with hearing problems. We also had sign language. We didn't have to deal with because people were on screen, the accessibility, but that's a real major problem. I think that we have decided that it's really important to look at the whole person and that we have to consider that with aging, and that we are all doing that every single day. I don't care if you're 5 years old or 100 years old, we're all aging. And with aging comes some disabilities that many of us did not have as young people. And so that is the need to recognize that and make sure, which is why we fight for language such as multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. I know right now it's very controversial. Hopefully it'll stay there. It is still in one para in the ministerial declaration in the opening. But it's really important. It is not, as some of the countries believe, that it's just to be there for the rights of gay people. It is really, as the example I gave of myself, I'm an older white Jewish woman with disabilities. That's multiple areas where I intersect with all of the SDGs. So I think for the women's major group, it's really become a focus that we've been trying to expand and bring in and make sure that no groups feel excluded. And April's one of the OPs, so she maybe, might want to touch on that a little bit more, and then she can talk from the regional.
Thank you, Beth. If I may add, so I think on just to add on the language, but I think it's really important in understanding the situation of women with disabilities is to have a grassroots-based evidence gathering. So, for example, what I've shared earlier, so we have a partner in Indonesia that is working with disaster-stricken Aceh, with your particular that was affected by the tsunami in, I forgot what year, but they have been working in that area, and their research, so as I mentioned earlier, the FDJ monitoring, they have been researching on the impacts or the situation of the women there. And there are many layers, intersectionalities of issues that women are facing there. So for example, the factor of culture and religion, fundamentalism, because, Muslim tradition has been very, in terms of treating women. And then they lack access to basic social services. They lack access to sexual and reproductive rights services. But through the process of SDG monitoring, they are also able to capacitate and also to educate the women. And in the process, they are able to engage their government. So, and that, I think it's important also when we're talking about the HLPF, because it's these women, it's these communities that we want to really highlight the voice here, or to bring the voices here. So yeah, just to share that story, and just to give a face on who are we actually fighting for in this kind of spaces.
Thank you so much. And just to note, I mean, it was mentioned earlier that there's, quite a bit of data gaps around disability. And I did want to, I'll drop it in the chat, but I did want to note that in the context of children in particular, UNICEF developed a model on children with functional difficulties or disabilities that has been included in MIX, which is a nationally representative household survey implemented in middle and low income countries since 2016. So we do now have data for about 60 or so countries on children with disabilities. And at the beginning of the year, we released a global report looking at the differences in well-being among children with disabilities, and between those with disabilities and those without disabilities, including from a gender perspective. So there might be some insights of interest in that report that I'll throw in the chat now. I wanted to ask Caitlin a question now. You noted during your presentation that feminist AI is being harnessed to deliver equality outcomes designed with inclusion at the core and creating new opportunities. Can you describe what some of those opportunities are in more detail, please?
Sure. Yes, of course. Thank you. I mean, our work is a little less descriptive and a little bit more applied. So we do applied research besides for the advocacy. And, we work in LAC, MENA, Southeast Asia, with a sort of a sister network, AI4D in Africa. But it's interesting because one of the new, and we subgrant, there's a whole system for this, but we do have a group in Thailand that actually has a group of philosophers who we put together with AI researchers, because they have a new definition of, impairment versus disability. It's only disability if you don't have access to services. So they're trying to sort of redefine impairment, and then we're going to try and see what happens from their research paper. So first we start with research papers, like a feminist AI framework that's just been done by Derechos Digitales, who does extraordinary work, framework for AI that we're going to go to prototype. We have a group, Via Libre in Argentina, that's working with natural language processing and trying to find a way to let different groups be able to debias this data. So anthropologists, sociologists, regular people on the street, not only technicians. So they're trying to democratize this notion of what is biased language. They're doing it from a Spanish perspective, but we hope to learn from them and then be able to bring it elsewhere, including to English. We're working with a Data Genero, who does also extraordinary work in Latin America. They're working with a criminal court in Buenos Aires that wants to make its gender-based violence data public, democratize this idea of what are the judgments. And so we're working with them now. They've also done an extraordinary paper. We're going to be taking that and making a tool so that people can just see what this one judge who runs this court really is committed to everybody understanding the judgments and how they work, but still with our protecting, of course, the precious data of the people who have been who have had to go to court to have their rights protected. We also are going to prototype. So those are things that we're making prototypes, but in Manila, we're trying to flip. There's a paper also from a group of philosophers trying to flip this notion of what mobility is to get it out of the pink ghetto. So it's not about women being protected and being isolated in like sumo suits in the metaverse, but like how can we grab spaces, and how does that work actually after they do their research with technologists? How can we make things that aren't just like rape apps, right? Like avoid this area. Women should be, we want to say, how can we take over areas and use the technology to actually make ourselves safer and give ourselves more agency. We also have a group working in Mexico, working with translators for indigenous languages in Mexico. So a lot of these groups do complementary work, but trying to figure out how to get their translation services sort of out there for indigenous populations who are often unaware of a legal system that is directing their lives and sort of putting all those things together. We also have a group in India that's working on an online gender-based violence app. They're actually already online, but they're doing bottom-up content moderation where they have the marginalized communities doing the population instead of the computer scientists and trying to see what are their definitions, what does that mean? And all of these things have all sorts of scientific research protocols. So all in all, the feminist AI is it pro-social, and is it really trying to sort of change power dynamics, which is what we're all trying to do as feminists, what SDG 5 is trying to help us accomplish, and that's kind of what we do.
Thank you so much. Those are really concrete examples, I think. So quite nice to sort of end that on that issue on a positive note. I think the advances being made given the gender biases that you started the pervasive gender biases that started the presentation. So there's a couple of questions from the chat that I'm going to open to the panelists and see who's brave enough to take them, because I think some of them are quite challenging. The first is, while gender equality is one of the goals of the SDGs, the world has seen widespread violations of this equality and women's rights in countries like Afghanistan. So how can these SDGs help Afghani women and others who are experiencing these kinds of inequality in the current climate? So I don't know if anybody has direct experience working in Afghanistan, but while you're thinking about who wants to tackle that question, I will ask another one. I don't know if any of our panelists have legal backgrounds and want to take this question, which asks, do we have an international law which can be implemented globally, or does each country go it alone, so to speak? So I thought perhaps Betty or April, or even Antra, if you want, can speak to some of the normative frameworks such as the CEDAW that are meant to hold countries accountable for advancing gender equality. Anyone want to go first?
Thanks, Lauren. I can just kick us off. I wouldn't have any country-specific examples, but I do think there's some things in the tracker that can help us. So if it's okay if I answer first? Okay, great. Yeah, so I think that it's a very important question, and part of the reason why we didn't want to have this tracker just as a global story was that at the global level, things just get mixed up, even at the regional level. So looking at what's happening in Afghanistan, what we really need is at least a national level assessment. And again, we've been talking that national is not enough. We need subnational and so on. But one thing that the tracker has been able to do is that you have country level data to play with. So taking the specific example of Afghanistan, if you look at the first target of SDG 5, that is on laws and policies specifically. So what we will see is, as we do this tracker over the years, and the new edition of the Gender Snapshot should come out right in time for the General Assembly in this year. So we will be able to see what's changed over time. And that's one of the ways from the data side to show what is happening and to bring enough visibility to some of these issues. I can drop a link in the chat on what UN Women has been working on specifically in Afghanistan, but this is more from my perspective as a researcher who's been working on the data issues, why we really need at least the national perspective on some of these issues.
Thank you so much. And everybody else is welcome to jump in on that question if they like, but otherwise maybe I will ask Betty and April. Can you speak to the question on legal and normative frameworks and how those can be used by countries collectively, perhaps? Thanks.
Well, I want to say part of the problem, and this is what we're even just facing right now with the ministerial declaration, is that many of the member states, many of the ministerials who are here are pushing back, with that their own national laws take precedence over anything that's happening, globally. Very few of the agreed conclusions really are binding. And that's the other problem. I'm not a lawyer, but there's a difference between a treaty and an outcome, an agreed conclusion. And so that's another loophole within the UN that many governments use to not have to follow. My own government does that all the time. I'm an American citizen, and they constantly are saying, we have our own laws. We don't need it. The United States is one of only 4 countries that hasn't signed on to CEDAW. And their reasoning is that because we have laws in this country. But as most of you have been following this week, we have seen that our Supreme Court is overturning some of those laws that protect women in this country. I don't want to get controversial, but that is some of the problem, the sovereignty issue within governments, and the fact that even HLPF, while we were trying to make it very similar to I don't know if anybody watched the session earlier with Ambassador Kamau and Nikhil Seth and Ambassador Donahue, but they tried to copy or mimic HLPF, and Naria certainly can speak to this, of the HRC processes with the peer reviews, and governments said no, voluntary only. So this is unfortunately, it's a major loophole within the UN. And I don't know, April, if you want to add more, or maybe Naira, if you want to add to that.
No? Anyone else want to come in on any of that content?
Yes, if I may, and I think
please.
Thank you. One aspect to, of course, or one thing to consider is that gender dynamics are cross-cutting, right? So yes, we have international law that specifically speaks to gendered aspects such as CEDAW, but also we need to not forget that all the other international laws, for instance, on labor rights, on migrant rights, etc., right? These are also international laws to consider, and same with the SDGs, right? This is a point that was made earlier that yes, there's one SDG on gender equality, but gender dynamics operate in all of the different SDGs. So I think and this is also why with the Gender Migration Index, we constructed it so that it can be applied with different international review processes, because we must not just focus on laws that particularly pertain to the issues that we are addressing, but also really seeing it that it cuts through lived experiences, right? One example that I would like to give is the recently established International Labor Organization Convention C190, for instance, on combating violence and harassment in the world of work, right? So this is a recently established international convention that now is in the process of countries. Just yesterday, Mexico ratified it, right? So there's a lot of push from civil society organizations to say, yes, let's move towards ratification by countries, but this is also an intersectional aspect, right? We're talking here about the world of work, and then we talk about, so there's labor law and policy in place, then there's policies in place in terms of combating violence and harassment more broadly. And then we have gender dynamics within that. And then for us as the Center for Migration, Gender and Justice, we have the migrant component as well. So this is something that maybe I would just like to add is that, yes, we can focus on the particular laws or frameworks that exist on the particular issues that we're concerned with, but not to forget the others where gender dynamics are a cross-cutting aspect.
Thank you so much for that reminder, and I see other colleagues nodding their heads in agreement. So we only have about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to take the opportunity to
Lauren,
make.
I'm sorry. I thought I put my hand up. I just
Oh,
wanted-
sorry, I didn't see it.
I just, Laura just made me think of something. One of the things that the Women's Major Group and my organization and a lot of women's organizations are pushing for is ILO 190, because again, those are binding agreements and it really protects women's rights. So we're trying to find routes outside of the traditional paths to get our local governments and our national governments to support. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you very much. That's another nice concrete example, I think. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to reflect on the content that we heard today during this learning session. And, what strikes me about these on the surface seemingly diverse presentations is that they all highlight critical aspects of gendering the data value chain. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the data value chain, which was developed by Data2X, it describes the process of data creation and use from first identifying a need for data to its final use and potential reuse. And so, we all can agree that the SDG indicator framework is a launching point for identifying gender data needs, although as all of the speakers have conveyed, it is only one component of a more expansive transformative project toward gender equality. Through Antra's initial presentation, we see that there are many pervasive gender gaps limiting our ability to monitor SDG progress from a gender perspective. And really beyond official statistics, other data sources are critical for monitoring and accountability, including digital technologies, which, as Caitlin emphasized, need to be harnessed to deliver equitable and feminist outcomes. There is also a critical role for women and girls to play in co-creating data collection methodologies, as illustrated by Dr. Golosorki's presentation of the Gender Migration Index. And critical to the data value chain is the idea that throughout the process, from one end of the value chain to another and back again, there should be constant feedback between producers and stakeholders who analyze and use the data to ensure that data are being harnessed for gender transformative change. In other words, it's not enough to just produce the data and hope that others will do something with it. And I think Betty and April's presentations illustrate quite nicely the importance of this continual engagement and underscore that if we truly want to build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic, women and girls must co-create the solutions, not only have the capacity to understand the data produced by others, but to identify the data needs in their own communities, to generate that data and to take it forward for advocacy for gender transformative change. So on that note, I hope our audience found this session both informative and inspiring. I know that I very much did. Thank you very much again to our speakers, especially for sticking to your time limits. You made my role as moderator very easy. We may actually wrap up 1 minute early. And thank you also to our audience for their engaging questions. This concludes the learning session. I hope all of you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone.